Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where you'll find information on what's going on the North Fork of Long Island. We'll be focusing on issues and opportunities going on in the community, as well as people and stories from the present and past. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and our guest today is Don Fisher. He is a longtime resident of Southold. He's currently president of the Railroad Museum of Long Island. He's also on the Emergency Management Committee for Southold, and he talks about his time growing up in Southold, as well as his interest in audio and how he got involved with the Southold School District, becoming an audio technician person for the district, and eventually volunteering for the Southold Fire Department and his time on there with the rescue squad, as well as EMS services for the area, and eventually talking about what's going on at the Railroad Museum of Long Island. So I hope you enjoy episode 7 with Don Fisher. Thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure to be with you, Chris.
Could you give us just a little background about yourself, where you were born?
Well, I'm Don Fisher, and I currently live in Southold, but I was born at the Greenport Hospital in 1953. And due to that, they tell me I'm considered a sterling baby because so many years ago, so many babies were born at Eastern Long Island Hospital, and my wife and I both were born there. And I was in 1953, and I've lived on the North Fork in Southold my entire life. And I was fortunate enough, after going to school at Southold High School, I was able to come back and be the audio-visual technician there for close to 40 years. Mm-hmm. It was my career, and I've been here and loving the East End my entire life.
And so you were born in Greenport, but were your parents living in Southold at the time?
Yes, they were. My dad had built a house in Southold when they were married. My mom was Catherine Grathwell. She had been living in Mattituck. Originally, the Grathwell family and the Corwin family were located in Cutchogue, but her home was in Mattituck. Mm-hmm. My dad had lived his entire life in Southold, was born at the home down in Bayview in Southold. And, of course, as people do, they got together and got married in 1951. And my dad was a carpenter. Mm-hmm. And he built a small cottage in town, one that he put additions on as the children were born. I was born in 1953, and my sister was born in 1963. And, of course, with 2 more children, we needed more bedrooms, and my dad added on 2 more bedrooms, and then eventually later, as my sister and I had friends and we were doing more family things together, we added a family room and a garage. And ultimately, after my sister and I had left the home, my mom and dad put a very nice enclosed sun porch on the back, and that's the way the house is today. So we grew up in Southold. My mom and dad were from the North Fork, and got married, and here we are.
And before that, did you say was your mom in Mattituck before that? Before they got married?
It's very interesting. My grandfather, Donald Grathwell, was born in Cutchogue, mm-hmm. and lived his whole early life in Cutchogue. My mother's family, my grandmother, was born in Brooklyn, mm-hmm. Mildred Perrine. And she used to summer along the shore in Cutchogue, and that's how she met my grandfather, Donald. Now, it was very interesting, a humorous story. They got married, and my grandfather said, well, I'm going to take you on a honeymoon to Puerto Rico, and we're going to live there because he had recently, during the Depression, gotten a job working for the agricultural department. And he and his brother were both down in Puerto Rico, and they were managing sugarcane plantations. So my grandmother from Brooklyn, she said, "Oh, this is wonderful. We'll go to Puerto Rico and it'll be a wonderful honeymoon." And he said, "Yeah, well, we're probably going to stay down there because I'm going to work." And she went down on a steamship with him. They got there. And of course, it was farm life. And this young girl from Brooklyn, with all the amenities of living in the city, is now thrown into the backwater of a very early Puerto Rico as a colony or a protectorate of the United States. And they had no running water. They had outhouses. And it was just like stepping back into the late 17, early 1800s here on Long Island in a farm. And of course, it was nothing to my grandfather because he grew up on a farm in Cutchogue. But for my grandmother, it was quite culture shock to go back on Puerto Rico like that. And there was no jumping on the ship and leaving your husband down there and coming back. I mean, she was stuck. Of course, as time went on and the amenities of civilization moved about, and my grandfather, moved up in the project. They got closer to the city of San Juan. My mother was born. My uncle was born in Puerto Rico. And my mom lived there for 21 years. She went to school there, went to finishing school, or what was a 2-year college degree that we talk about today, and went to work for a bank, got into finance. When she was 21 years old, the family came back to Mattituck, came back to the North Fork. And she worked for the North Fork Bank and Trust. And that's how she met my dad. And my dad was a carpenter here on the North Fork. He had gone into the service during World War II, and he had been a carpenter after high school. So with his skills, they did not send him to Europe or to Japan. He stayed for the entire war in North Carolina, and he was a carpenter early on, building barracks and overseeing the contractors that built up the training base. He was in the Air Force. Eventually, he moved on. He became a sergeant, and he was involved with munitions. It was a training base for bombers, and he was something of an expert on 50 caliber machine guns that were on the B-25 bombers. And he also oversaw a group of men who took care of, they were practice bombs, but still they were physically armaments bombs that were loaded into the B-25s for practice and for training pilots that went to Europe and over to the Pacific to fight. And he spent his entire 4 years plus stateside during World War II, being a carpenter and being an armament specialist.
Wow. And while growing up at that time, for you, did they have any traditions or any traditions that were passed down from your grandfather or grandmother?
Christmas was big, all family birthdays and holidays, the religious of Easter gatherings. We were basically 50% English and 50% German. So it was a very Protestant family, and we celebrated Protestant holidays such as Easter and Christmas. Those were the biggest holidays in our time. Thanksgiving was also a very important holiday of family getting together. The Christmas tree, typically a traditional German decoration, was always big. We'd always go out and get a fresh tree and bring it into the house. There were no artificial trees when I was young. Wouldn't have an artificial tree. I can remember the aluminum trees with the lights on them, and my mother and father were really kind of disgusted seeing those things. We always had a live tree. A nativity was always a very important part of our decoration, if you would. So those were our cultural holidays. Very Protestant, very American, if you will. And of course, my family continues them to this day. My wife, Susan, is from Polish descent, and I was accepted and warmly adopted into a very, very large Polish family. And of course, with a Catholic background, all of the same holidays and religious things that were important to my family were important to her family, and we've continued with them to this day.
And did you have any specific meals for Christmas time? Was it more German influence?
Interestingly, because my mom grew up in Puerto Rico, there's quite a bit of Latino tradition in some of the dishes we would have. Arroz con pollo, chicken with rice was always big for a dinner at our home. Not necessarily the holidays; they were always turkeys. But I can tell you, the stuffing that I love the most, it has olives and red roasted peppers in it, many onions, and the herbs and spices that my mother would put in definitely have a taste and a flair toward Latino and Hispanic from her tradition of eating food in Puerto Rico. And of course, I love it. And I make that stuffing, and my sister makes that stuffing for the holidays. So our turkeys, and again, we were always turkeys for Thanksgiving and for Christmas. For Easter, it would be a lamb or possibly a ham. And it was something that we looked forward to because you didn't get turkey every day. Certainly you didn't get stuffed turkey. You didn't get lamb every day. Ham, that was on the menu from now and then during the year. But definitely German English with potatoes, turnips, local vegetables, cauliflower, broccoli, sprouts. To this day, I love all of those things that are made here on the farms on Eastern Long Island. Wonderful vegetables.
And would they get most of their produce and supplies from the farms?
Absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely.
As you were a kid, too?
Yeah, growing up, we would go to the local farm stands. I can remember one my mother was a favorite was the Fred Lappy farm stand down on South Harbor Road, going down toward the Southold Park District off of the main road in Southold. That was a regular stop of hers. We always had fresh vegetables. Local potatoes. I mean, we were the potato king of the United States for so many years. You never had boxed potatoes. You always had potatoes
Fresh.
that you would, you'd peel them and make mashed potatoes and all sorts of wonderful potato dishes. And of course, very, very German.
And was there as much duck farming out here, or was that more towards Riverhead?
That was in Riverhead and Jamesport and Aquaborg area.
Oh, okay.
And then going over to the south side for Eastport, Cinema Riches. But I can remember as a young boy going to Riverhead, and where BJ's is now, there was duck farms on both sides of Main Road there.
Wow.
And going down Northville Turnpike south into the village, there were duck farms to the east side or to the left as you were going south on Northville Turnpike. And right where BJ's is, the ducks actually went under Route 25. There was a creek that ran under the road there, and the ducks could move back and forth from one side of the farm to the other. The Route 25 went right through the center of the farm. And of course, if you went over to the south side to Eastport, you could see the duck farms as you were traveling along the roads. But it was just a sea of white ducks out there.
Yeah.
If our listeners today in the fall prior to Thanksgiving go on Route 25 through Calverton, where you have Molosky's poultry farm, and if you go by and the turkeys that they're raising, those beautiful white turkeys, and you look out there and you see that field of white, it looks like, well, that's what the duck farms look like. And of course today the duck farmers, which is down to the Corwin family, which are I am a Corwin. My great grandmother was a Corwin, lived in Cutchogue, so we're all part of that branch of the family. The ducks are kept inside, so you don't see that like we did back in the 1950s and into the early 1960s. You just saw the sea of white look like snow out there. It was all Peking ducks.
And you could you? I've heard people say they could smell if you drive by at the right time.
Oh yes. Well, and if our listeners on certain days, evenings when the weather's just right, you can periodically get an odor even today in Aquaborg. Sure, the duck effluent is there. Of course, today it's nowhere near what it used to be because with modern facilities of dealing with the sewage and such, you don't smell it as often. But
No.
you can still get a whiff as you drive through Aquaborg,
Yes.
especially if it's a very damp evening and the ceiling is quite low and some fog. You can get a odor of duck.
And so you said you grew up in Southold. How was it like going to school through elementary, middle school, high school there?
Well, it's interesting. Our home was behind the American Legion. So I could literally get up in the morning and look out the kitchen window and see the school. It was within half a mile, third of a mile from my home. So I never took the bus. Many of our listeners probably had the experience of riding on a bus for a period of time in the morning and a period of time in the afternoon to get home. I never did that, which allowed me to sleep in a little bit more, very comfortable. I'd get up and have my breakfast, and literally in about 6 minutes, I could walk from my home through the American Legion. We'd walk cross lots and go in the back door at the school. It was a very welcoming place to me. My grandfather, Henry Wells Fisher, had been for many years the chief custodian of the Southold School District. He retired shortly after I started as a kindergarten student there. So my pop-pop, my grandfather, had a large imprint on the building. He was there when they constructed the 1938 part, the edifice that you see now as you go up Oak Lawn Avenue. He was there for that. They were constructing that during the 38 hurricane, and my father was upstairs in a classroom, and scaffolding was coming down, and he ran down to tell my grandfather, and my grandfather said, yes, we're keeping the students here. We're not letting them go home because the hurricane was upon us, and the scaffolding was falling from around the cupola that you see today. So my grandfather was very much in that building as it was built up, and I always felt for the 40 years that I worked there that his spirit still was in that building, because I had a superintendent of schools that I worked with, and she said, I can't stand being in this building at night because there's noises. And she says, I honestly think that there's ghosts here. And I used to laugh. And she said, I know, sometimes you're here very late. You're here later than I am. She said, how can you do it? And I said, it's only my grandfather walking around the halls, making sure the doors are locked. They said, Pat, don't worry about it. I said, he won't harm you,
Yeah.
But no, from the time I went to school there as a 5-year-old kindergarten student till the time I graduated, the Southold School was a warm and friendly place, and I have great memories of being there as a student. My teachers and I got along. I was not an A student by any means. If anything, it was easy for me to get through grades, and I was kind of lazy in that respect. But it was always a welcoming and warm facility, as it is, I'm sure, today. I've been out of the district for 15 years now as a retiree. But for the 40 years that I worked there, as I say, it was home. It was a home away from home.
And you said you had a good experience with the teachers. It wasn't, because I always hear from my grandparents' generation, they said, well, some of those teachers were strict, and you'd have a few instances of, I don't know, they would say things about with the stick, or they had to with the soap, but I don't know if that.
Yeah. Well, for all the years I was there, there were stories of some teachers that would come along and snap your knuckles with a ruler if, you were acting out or you were not paying attention in class. But I never experienced that. None of my teachers ever came around with a ruler. Once in a while you'd see one of those fiber, cloth like wool erasers that you use on the cloth boards. chalkboards. One of them might go flying to get somebody's attention, but not done with anger like that.
Yeah.
It was more like, hey, whoa, your attention, please, and
Yeah.
the it might go, and that didn't happen very often. The teachers at Southold School, yes, were they strict? Certainly for the time. Our culture in our country has changed. I worked at the school district from 1971 until 2008. And then, of course, I was a student there for 13 years. And as I'm sure all of our listeners can relate if you're of a certain age, our culture and our mores in this country have changed. They've evolved, Some may think for the better, some may think for the worst. But were they strict? Yes, but I don't feel that they were punitive or certainly not abusive to students in Southold. I never experienced that. But yeah, you were given an assignment and you were expected to have it and be prepared when you came to class. And if you didn't have it, you would be admonished and you would get a poor grade.
Yeah.
Which really in life, if you don't perform and get the job done, there's going to be consequences. From the very least, a goal has not been met and some A doesn't go to B, that doesn't go to C because you didn't do what you had to do. So that was very much reinforced in all of our classes. I'd have to say that, for instance, in my language classes and some of my math classes, my teachers really put up with me. I was much more conducive to the humanities, English, history, social studies. Those are the things that I loved, and I could interface and connect with. Science, math. I can remember my chemistry and physics teacher being very frustrated. He said, I know you can do better than this, and I know we got into the periodic table of elements and the coefficients of molecular strategy construction at that time, and I aced it with like a 90 or a 95, and he comes up and he throws the paper down in front of me. He said, "Why don't you do this all the time, Fisher?" I said, "I don't know, but this molecular structure seemed to capture my imagination, and I really got into it." And he said, "Well, I know you can do the work." And it was. Yeah, I look back with great fondness on all of these. But yeah, you had to do the work. Yeah, as really we have to do today. You gotta produce.
Yep.
And be wondered and happy with what you produce.
Yeah. And did you have any idea what you wanted to do coming out of high school, or were you thinking, did it change through middle school, early high school, then as you were getting ready to graduate?
Well, the story in the family was that when I was a very small baby and I had to have my diapers changed, my mother, to keep me occupied and so that I wasn't kicking all over the bassinet, would give me a small flashlight. And I would use that flashlight as a toy while she changed my diapers. And my father would say that the first word that I spoke was flashlight. So the point being, the illumination, the electricity of the battery, illuminating the bulb and creating a spotlight seemed to fascinate me as a very tiny infant. And as I grew up, electricity and electronics has been a part of my life to this day, and continuing on. So in school, in high school, I was in rock and roll bands, and I wasn't the greatest guitar player at all. I actually matriculated over to the bass guitar because I was so poor as a guitar player. But one of the things that I brought to the band, that I brought to the barbecue under the tent, was the sound system. Because my love for electronics and audio, I was building sound systems in my basement and putting things together. And I was the guy in Southold that had the PA system. So you could hear the singers and you could hear the various instruments. And I continued with that through life. And being the audiovisual technician for the school district was all about that. And I was also a lighting technician, lighting for theater. Worked professionally in New Hampshire for a short time, doing lighting and sound. And at that time, because we all did various trades, I was also involved with the set construction and design. My dad being a carpenter, some of that woodworking, brushed off onto me. Mm-hmm. But electricity, being an electrician and working in electronics, when I was in high school, it was the direction I was going in, and it's done me well. It's been my life.
And did they have classes you could take at high school at that time, or were they still, because I know they had the home ec and some other things, but for that time, were they starting to get into some of that where you could take that, or was that just something you were doing outside of school, or like, oh, I'm going to do this in my spare time playing with different electronic equipment?
At my time at Southold as a student, the curriculum, everyone took at least one credit of shop during their 4 years of high school. And the girls took one credit of home economics during your 4 years. They were considered electives. So every year you had an opportunity to pick 2 or 3 electives per semester. And people that really were into hands-on mechanical stuff, there was a motor shop. Mm-hmm. I took engine shop. I took electric shop. I took metal shop. I took all of them because that was something I loved and enjoyed. I took drafting. And then, interesting, we had a very forward-thinking principal in Richard Hilary. Mm-hmm. And Richard, at the time, 1969, 1970, he was expanding the number of electives at the school. Rightly so, because you're going to learn so much better when you're doing something that interests you. Mm-hmm. And then you can see how you bring the basics of your mathematics and your science and your English, and you reinforce everything when you're doing things in the electives. So they were important classes, and Richard saw that as a way to stimulate and engage students. So he went to our home and economics teacher, Marcella Winters, and said, listen, I want you to do a cooking class for the males. And I can remember, because I worked with Marcella for many years after I came back to the school as an employee, and she said, you guys were the first all-male class I ever did. She said, I never wanted to do it. She said, my idea of having a bunch of men in the kitchen, it was threatening. I was afraid. And she said, I thought I was going to have all kinds of problems with you guys.
Yeah.
She says, Don, it turned out to be the best class I ever had. And I was in her inaugural class that fall.
Wow.
And I can cook to this day because of Marcella Winters and because, Richard Hilary was expanding the number of classes that we could take as electives. So not only did I have the advantages of all the shop classes that we used to have, but I had a great baste, bake, and broil was the name of and we did everything from learning how to properly set a table to making your menus look colorful so people would sit down and want to eat them, to vary the various foodstuffs on the plate so that it looked good, to bringing in measurements when we did baking, how to do a pie crust. Oh my God, if I look back today, and I've told people this, it was probably the most worthwhile class that I took because we all want to eat.
Yep.
And we want to eat good. And
Yes.
Marcella and Richard, I can cook today because of them. But also the hard, solid shop classes have also done me well.
But what year was that they decided to do that?
It was my senior year, so it would have been September of 1970. And then it was only a half year, one semester class.
Yeah.
So we were in there from September until Christmas break. And then I couldn't tell you what my elective was for the second half of that year. But boy, did we ate well. And
And that's interesting that there is that transition there, because usually you just think, I guess even if you went further back, it'd just be the boys do the shop and then the girls do the home ec. But to decide to change that in 1970 and then having the teacher be kind of not really on board with it, but then after she got through the first class, it's like, okay, it's not too bad with these guys.
Well, you can, if you're willing to step into that area that you're not terribly comfortable with, you can break down those stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened. It was like, oh, I don't want to do this. But then once she got involved with us, and there is a lot of similarity between the technical side of the things that you learn in shop and mechanics that you actually bring into the kitchen. Your kitchen is your shop. And that's the way we looked at it. And all of the appliances and the spoons and the measuring cup, those are your tools. And instead of working with wood or with metal, you're working with potatoes and vegetables. You're working with chickens and turkeys and hams. And it really is the science of cooking. And that's what we realized as guys. And Marcella saw that we brought measuring, the ability to cut, to work with bones, if you will. You're cutting up a piece of... we brought those skills to the kitchen shop. The girls didn't naturally bring with them. They had to learn that. Well, we've been cutting stuff since we were kids, So it was a real eye-opener. I also have to comment... the shop teachers, Gil Miner and Frank Parker, Richard Hilary went to them and said, listen, I want you to give hard shop classes to girls, because these girls should know how to be able to fix things when they have a home and they get out on their own before they're married. You can't always depend on the men to be there to help them. And I think Gil and Frank they were kind of like, they never said anything to me, but I'm sure they're like, oh man, we're going to bring a bunch of girls into this shop. And but that worked too. That certainly prepared a lot of women to be able to take care of a home, the mechanics in a home, change a light switch and things. Yeah, that you really need to know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I'm just thinking of today, and I personally don't have a lot of those handy skills in terms of, I guess I did take some body shop classes, but that was when I was younger. But I don't know, not to say a whole generation, but it doesn't seem like usually you have to call the person to come do some little thing where usually people could just fix that back then. And
I think technology, as good as it is today with our cell phones and microcomputers and all the things that we can do with them, it took away a lot of that in our culture, where I can remember back in the 1980s as computer-aided drafting, computer-aided design, the use of your computers, as we now see as robotics, would function to operate the metalworking tools, the lathes and the cutting stuff. The focus, and I can remember very distinctly when this happened in the early to mid-1980s, we moved away from hands-on shop, and the shop rooms were turned into computer centers. And those computers were hooked up to machines. So instead of the student going from the classroom shop into the physical shop and running the machines, and you'd go in and you'd load a piece of metal stock, and then you'd go back into the other room with the computers, and you'd look through the window or through the glass case and watch the machine do all the work that you used to have to do with your hands, and the computer did it all. Of course, one of the advantages was every piece of widget that came out of the machine was identical, and there was no waste, because once you had the program right, and once the computer took over, you could go take a nap. And my sense was, we are losing something. We are losing the ability to use our hands and to get down to turning a wrench, and we did. I like to think that today I understand that shop classes are coming back. and they're teaching basics of electricity. Of course, our BOCES programs have continued to thrive over the years, where students that wanted to learn a trade, learn a skill, could go to that and get that hands-on training that you need. But it's so important to have plumbers and carpenters and electricians today. And if you know how to do that stuff, you're going to save a lot of money at home.
Yes, definitely. So I was just curious, through middle school, high school, did you have any role model that stuck out to you separate from family that you could think of in the world, even whether if it was a celebrity or something on TV that you looked up to?
Well, being something of a history buff and loving the history of the world and my country and the North Fork and Long Island, the people that I most admired, the two guys, to this day, Benjamin Franklin and Abraham Lincoln. Now, that may sound funny for someone that's in middle school, but I can remember when I was in fifth grade, we were learning about the Civil War. And that opened up for me a great interest in those hard times in our country where the South was divided from the North. And it's something that I have read about and studied on the side. And Abraham Lincoln really became a shining light to me throughout that. His ability to navigate through those hard times where this country was divided, as some people might think it's divided to this day. He was there and he navigated through that. His early life as an attorney and growing up and working for the various people that he did, his interest in the railroad and support of the railroad as an industry and seeing it as a way to tie this great country together that was so disparate. It was the East Coast and the West Coast, and he saw that as a vision. The tragedy of his death, essentially making him a martyr, and highlighting and elevating his position through all of that. He was definitely a person that I looked up to, and I could see the way he did things I would like to do. The other guy, of course, was Benjamin Franklin, a wonderful statesman, an inventor. And he was into electricity.
Yeah.
Put the kite up and let the lightning hit it and see the key glow, if you will.
Yes.
But even, be a little bit facetious there, but he was very much involved with the hard sciences like that. And the wonder that he had to look at things and think about them and to imagine them, and the soft things, like the Postal Service, the changes and the advancements that he and his associates put in. And he was a postal general of the postal office back before we were a country, when the British were here. He was under British control, but he worked the Postal Service and brought it into what it is today. There were so many things that he had his finger on. His statesmanship going back and forth to Europe during the hard times of the Revolution, and getting the favor of the Germans and the favor of the French to help us fight against the British. That whole ability to bring people together, that was something that I like to do to this day, and he could do that. So it wasn't anyone local. If I were to pick someone local, interesting, and this wasn't until I was 32 years old. And I tell this story. When you grow up here on the east end of Long Island, we are such a little bit of paradise. We're surrounded by water on three sides. We have our own micro-meteorology here. Our springs are cooler, and our falls are warmer. It's such a soft, welcoming area. You can understand why so many people want to come here and retire and to live here. I took all of that for granted growing up. The farms, the open space, because I didn't know any better. I never lived in the city. I never put up with that kind of congestion and all the concrete and asphalt. And you just took it for advantage. Took it for granted, rather. And it wasn't until I was 32 years old. My son and my daughter were both born, and I was working a second job during the summer when school was closed for the Shelter Island North Ferry. And one night a week, I'd get these college kids with me, and we would clean a ferry boat, high-pressure washer, and we would do a different boat every week. And when it was dinner time, we'd go up on top of the pilot house and sit there and have our lunch, if you will, our break. And I can remember very distinctly to this day, there was a day in August, and there we are, we're having our break, and the sun is setting in the west, and that dark blue sky is coming up from the east. The night is coming on, and the lights are coming on in Greenport Harbor. And the water in the harbor was like glass. It was just one of those quiet, calm nights. Again, a soft evening on the North Fork. And I just sat there and I watched this play out. And what snapped into mind was all of the writings of Paul Stoutenberg. Now, Paul was a shop teacher at Greenport High School. And a friend. His children went to school at Southold. His wife Barbara worked at Southold with me in the guidance department. And Paul would write an article about the North Fork, the environment, and the flora, the fauna, the animals, whatever, every week for the Suffolk Times. And I'd always read them. And I was like, oh, yeah, this is nice. Well, Paul could write a good article.
Yes.
But again, taking it all for granted because it's all I ever knew. Yeah. But here we are. We're sitting up there, the three of us, and I'm watching this play out, and the sun is going down, and the reds, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky that night, and just the electric lights coming on, shining off the water, and the other ferry going back and forth. I said, my God, this is what Paul is talking about. And I'm 70 years old now, so at 32 years old, it finally kicked me in the head. My God, what a wonderful place we live in. This truly is a paradise on earth here on the east end of Long Island. And that's where it's at today even. So yes. It's important to us.
And was there any point after you graduated from high school that because you said you didn't see that until you were 32, but after high school, was there a time where you're like, I want to leave the North Fork?
Well, it's very interesting. You know, as much as I had a good school career, I was restless to the point that I really didn't want to go to college. You know, I'd had enough time sitting on my fanny in a classroom and reading and listening, and I guess I felt that I knew a lot more than I did, and I was ready to get out of Southold and not necessarily go back into a classroom, but to produce, to do work, and to do the things that I enjoyed: lighting, electricity, electronics, radio, television, all of that sort of thing. But here you are in 1971 as a high school graduate. You know, where are you going to go? And of course, this was at a time when everybody should go to college, sort of thinking was coming to the fore. I decided that I would go into the military. And at 17 years old, I signed up to go in at 18, which would have been that October after graduation. Also, just on a lark, Richard Hilary had said to me, again, he was a very forward, visionary type of person. He said, you know, Don, you're good at what you do with the electronics, and I was kind of like the AV geek in high school.
Yeah.
Somebody had a problem with a 16 millimeter projector or any kind of electronic equipment. You know, where's Fisher? Go find him. Let's get him in here and fix the projector. And Dick Hilary, Richard saw what I could do, and he was thinking about the future at the school. He said, I would like you to apply to become the audiovisual technician. And nobody had audiovisual people in 1970, 1971. So this was like a first for any school district, and particularly one here on the East End. So I said, sure, I can do that. And I can remember actually videotaping in black and white my presentation as to why Southold School should have an audiovisual person. and kind of mirroring what Richard O'Larry had said, that this is the future. Media is the message, and you need someone to be your IT guy of the period. This was before there were IT guys and computers, but you needed a technical person to keep the infrastructure running, and I'm the guy you want. At that time, I didn't think I had any chance of getting that job because not only was it a shot in the dark, because there were no... I was applying for a job that wasn't there. Nobody had AV people at that time. It wasn't a thing.
And were you still in the military?
No, I never got there.
You never, oh.
I never got there because, but I figured I was going. And I can remember the Staff Sergeant Tettleton to this day, the guy that was indoctrinating me. And I was all set to go when I turned 18. The papers were signed. I'd taken my ASVAB tests, scored very high on the mechanical and the electronics. And my docket, I was going to be a radio person, repairing and servicing radios and doing technical work. So this was my path. And at the time, there was basically a revolt against high school taxes. What else is new, And I can remember that year, I think they had 5 votes to get a budget for the Southold School District. So the fact that there was never a job like I was applying for, it just wasn't there. And the fact that there wasn't going to be any money to hire me, I was looking forward to going into the service, getting out and getting my hands dirty and repairing radios and making communications around the world. And they did. They had 4 votes that year, and every vote for the budget went down that summer. Mm-hmm. I was working in New Hampshire, doing the lighting and sound at a summer stock theater company up there, and it was Labor Day weekend. I was in the process of putting the building that we had the theater in back in order. We were clearing out, and there were light fixtures that had to be hung up and work on the building. And the phone rang, and the box office manager said, "Don, is some guy by the name of Stan Krause on the phone for you? Do you know him?" I said, "Oh, yeah, he's the superintendent of schools. He was Richard O'Larry's boss. He wants to talk to you." It was a Friday. I remember this. I came down off the ladder, and I picked up the phone, and I said, "Mr. Krause, what can I do for you?" He said, "Well, I'm glad I found you." He said, "Do you still want that job?" And I said, "The audiovisual technician job?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "We finally, after the 5th vote, we got a budget last night." Mm-hmm. And he said, we had to pare the budget down 5 times, to get a vote passed. But he said, "I was able to keep the money in there for your position." Now, granted, this is 1971, and I made $4,000 the first year. It was nothing compared to today. But I'm like, well, do I continue on the trip and possibly end up in Vietnam or Cambodia or Thailand getting shot at? Or do I stay in Southold School and take my dream job? So I said, yes. I said, I would very much like to have that job. He said, "Be in my office Tuesday morning, day after Labor Day." And he said, "We'll get you set up. We've got a room for you." And he said, "We'll go over your responsibilities," and never looked back after that. That was history. I got off the phone, and I picked it up again, and I called Staff Sergeant Tettleton in Riverhead, and I said, "Sarge, I got my dream job." I said, "Tear up the papers. I'm not going for indoctrination." And he said, "I'm happy for you." He said, "This really isn't a good time." Yeah. And he said, "Good luck with that job." He said, "Make something of it." And I was there for 39 years, 10 and a half months. It was a great career.
Wow.
So I came very close to going into the service because I didn't want to go to college. Instead, I ended up coming right back into education and supporting the educators and supporting the students and helping to keep the infrastructure running. And, of course, that opened up, everything from the old cassette tapes that we didn't have to VHS and video and, to computers, to what we're working with today and take for granted. But those were the days of 16 millimeter films and 35 millimeter film strips.
And through that, in the 70s, when you started teaching at Southold
Was there a time where the Vietnam War started that you had that dream job, but you also thought you almost were going into the military? That was that a were you thinking of that while you were teaching? Anytime that was in the news or like, oh, I'm glad I'm over. I'm glad I'm teaching.
There was a defining moment. It was years later, but living here on the East End, it was pretty insular. Now, my best friend, his brother was killed in Vietnam. Um, Another acquaintance lost a son in Vietnam during the time. And I can remember as a student, we went out and we lined up in front of the school as, their body was taken to the cemetery after they were brought home. Um, it never really sunk into me what happened, because this was such a beautiful place and this was such a great life here on the East End. You were insular and you're so far away from it. As a student, there were other things I was doing. I wasn't thinking about getting shot or getting killed over in Vietnam. Yeah, it happened, but that, as so many times, that happened to other people. You didn't think about it. So it was easy for me to say, I'm going to go into the Army and I'm going to get this education in electronics and I'm going to fix radios and do all these other things. And I honestly never thought, it's not going to happen to me. I'm not going to get shot at. All right. So fast forward about, 10 years later, Wally Coots had a breakfast place and luncheon place down in Southold Village, and that's where I went for breakfast every morning before I went to work. And we're down there, and the gang's sitting along the counter, and we're telling stories. And I just told a story that I told our podcast listeners. And Wally threw his spatula down and turned around. He came up and he starts yelling at me, "You idiot. You're crazy. What are you doing?" I mean, we were all like, whoa, what's going on here? And Wally really had a moment. This was a very emotional, maybe a PTSD moment. I don't know, but he was really like, and what are you talking about? And he said, that's what I did. He said, I went into the Army. And he said, yeah, I got trained to fix radios and all that other stuff, but they needed radio operators. And he said, you have no idea how many of my friends that were radio operators were killed, because the enemy would look for the antennas and the radios in the field, and they would shoot the communicator first. Because once the communicator was killed, the enemy knew that the officers and the men couldn't call back for reinforcements, they couldn't call for air support, and by knocking out the communications, the enemy knew that they took that piece of technology away. So he said, we were sitting ducks. They looked for us. That's kind of like when it hit me, It's a good thing that you ended up at Southold School, because I could have been out there in Vietnam in a rice paddy getting shot at simply because I had a radio strapped to my back. And that's when it kind of had a sobering moment, and I remember that very clearly to this day. I was blessed with having the opportunity to stay in Southold and do work that I loved rather than get shot at in Vietnam.
And with your time at Southold School District, what would you say was your favorite thing that you enjoyed the most over the years there?
I got to be honest with you. Because this was a job that I created, a job that Richard Hilary saw as a vision, and basically gave me full reign to do what had to be done. Everything I did in that job was really enjoyable. Now, that's not to say you didn't have days when you went in and you hung your head and like, oh man, I'll be glad when this day's over. Yeah. For all the reasons that everybody has a day like that. But I got to say, it was all cutting edge, because society was bringing new technology into the classrooms, and I was on the front page with that stuff. And I learned it from the beginning up and helped staff to implement that technology in their classrooms, showed them how to use it. And much of the staff was very good at using the stuff. As photocopiers came on the scene, Well, we needed somebody to take care of the photocopiers, so I ended up being the photocopier guru and ran the print shops for the district. That in turn consolidated a lot of printing and things into my office that had been handled by individual secretaries kind of willy-nilly across the district. Well, now everything went to a central place. It was organized. It was taken care of, and it was brought back. So it was another service, and that was great. Telephones and radio systems. I installed. We were talking about this the other day. I think I installed four different telephone systems throughout the district.
Wow.
And each one we went from a key system that was there when I started working, and I had to take care of that and move telephones around and work with New York Telephone at the time, to our first computer-based switching system, where I learned the elements of programming, 8-bit programming, because each telephone could be programmed differently. That was an eye-opener. And then as things got smaller and more compact, and you took a laptop and you did your programming on a laptop, the third system came in, and then the fourth system, the last one I put in, was a fantastic system using T1 lines and DSL and interconnect. It was everything miniaturized and modernized and so much easier to set up. And the capacity for more telephones. Every classroom had a telephone that you could dial out in. And when I got there, we didn't even have an intercom in the classrooms.
Wow.
So the changes there. So telecommunications. Put in the first radio system at the district for talking to the school buses and walkie-talkies for the custodians. So there was nothing in my career that I saw as poor or bad. It really, it was a fascinating career.
Yeah.
And everything that came up, bang, I was right there with it, and presented it and brought it into the district, and I just had a ball.
And you pretty much brought or kept the school district in Southold connected with telecommunication and updating things with the computers when they came in, and just making sure that the students and the school district had the right tools to keep functioning and bring them into newer technology
certainly from audio and visual side. Now, computers, that was another story. To this day, I see a computer as a tool, and I had to be sold on it. And I can remember some of my associates. One in particular, Keith Hargy, was the physics and chem instructor for the high school, and he got onto the computer bandwagon very early on. And I can remember our first computer was a terminal that was tied in over the telephone line, which I was involved in making sure that connection worked. But the mainframe, the actual computer itself, was up in Riverhead or someplace even further west at Bosie's.
Oh.
And we had a dumb terminal. And the math department had the computer. The computer was one, and it was a dumb terminal. And they used an acoustic coupler over a dedicated telephone line to make this thing work with the mainframe or the CPU, the brain box that was off campus. And I was like, this thing's a toy. It kind of goes back to like what we were saying about the shop classes. You used the computer and you made the machine work in the other room, and you weren't doing anything. Well, you weren't doing anything. You type some programming bits and bytes in there and sit back and wait for something to come back from up west.
Yeah.
And I was just like, no, this isn't going to work in my world. So Keith Hargy used to just, oh man, you got to get a computer fish. You got to get a computer down in your office, and you can do this and that and the other thing. No. I said, I got to see what this thing's going to do for me in my work.
And when exactly was this around?
Well, we're in the mid 1970s, late 70s.
When they were still the bigger computers, but there weren't personal.
No, not at all.
Computers,
not at all. They, everything was still be connected up to mainframes. Now, when PCs came around, the Apple II and the Apple IIc, this was before the Lisa and the Macintosh as we think of it today, and certainly before Windows. That was somebody's pie in the sky idea. Everything was run on DOS, and I'm just like, oh, this is too much work. I can remember the television at home had finally broken and given up the ghost. And this must have been about 1982, 1983, and I wasn't sold on computers yet, but my wife Susan was taking a class at Suffolk Community College. We hadn't started our family yet. She was taking classes in early childhood development, and she had to type a lot of papers. Television broke down, and it's like, okay, do we go out and buy a new color TV, or do we buy one of these computers? And she said, well, I'd really like to have a computer because with a word processor, it would be so much easier for me to type up my papers. All right. Well, we didn't watch much television anyway, so we bought our first computer. Now I had a computer. I didn't have one at work. And Harji and some of the guys, they're beating on me. Oh, you got to get computers. Mm-hmm. And, the Apple II was coming out, and IBM PC was starting to get going. We didn't have Windows yet. Everything was still DOS operated. So it was my wife who actually showed me how to use a computer as a tool, because I did a lot of writing, but I was working with an IBM Selectric typewriter.
Yes.
And I also did a lot of databases, if you will, spreadsheets for inventory and control at school. So at the time I was an officer in the Southold Fire Department. We're coming up on our 100th anniversary. So that created even more documents that I had to put out. So I'm watching my wife, and I said, well, I'm going to try this thing. So when she wasn't using it, I started using it. And I started producing documents for the fire department. And I started producing documents for work. And as I began to see how to use the applications, I began to develop a vision as how I could use this spreadsheet. I could use this database at work. And it's going to be less work for me because the computer's going to take over some of the calculating and things like that. And of course now the programs were getting more interfaced and intuitive to run, and you didn't have to build your word processing. You didn't have to build your database. You didn't have to build your spreadsheet because Bill Gates and Jobs and Wozniak were doing it for you. And you could take that application, that program, and start using it right away to your benefit as a tool. That's when I finally went back in and put money in my budget to buy a computer. And I can remember Harji was furious with me because he was a PC guy. He was an IBM guy. And I bought an Apple. And I think at the time I was the only office in the entire building, in the entire district, that went with Apple. But because I was doing a lot of graphics and working through the print shop and creating, Apple was the way to go at the time. If it was going to strictly be business, I would have stayed with a PC. Of course, eventually, everybody kind of caught up with each other with their programs and their applications. And I got to the point where I was working just as easily in the PC world as I was in the Apple world. And there really was a cultural difference, the yin and the yang of the Apple guys and the PC guys.
Yes.
And I eventually switched over to PC, and now I'm not using any Apples. I still got a couple of Apple computers at home, but I'm all PC. So to get into the IT side, into the computer side, I was late coming to the party, and there were many other well-educated teachers and people in the district that really inaugurated and ushered in computers at the district. Now, the one caveat to that is that years later, well up into the 90s, almost to 2000, what had happened was each department kind of created their computer system to their needs. So from kindergarten through 12th grade, there were disparities between the systems. There were Apple computer laboratories. There were more PC computer laboratories. And there was truly a cultural difference. There were some teachers that they didn't want to look at a Bill Gates PC. And there were other teachers that laughed at the people who were working with Apple.
Yeah.
So Patricia Hennessy was our superintendent. And there was money available to start networking, and the idea would be to bring all of the disparate laboratories together so that our network would work. And I ended up on a committee that was made up of educators, administrators, and people from the community to create what is now the backbone networking system that they still work off of our foundation, our infrastructure that we set up back in the late 90s. And with my knowledge of the buildings and the running of the cables for the televisions and the radio systems and the phone communication systems, I ended up with the third working group. We had subcommittees underneath the entire organization. I had the third working group, which was to take the information from the first two. We had a group that did inventory. What's all of our hardware? What have we got here? What software are we working with? And then the second group actually held interviews with students, faculty. How do you want to incorporate computer and IT into your day, into your education? And then they came back to us, and it was our job as the third working group to take this information, put it together. What did we have to buy? What could we continue to use? And how are we going to build the physical network to get everything to work together?
Yeah.
I loved a challenge like that. And I had some great people in the community who worked in IT, in business, three in particular. And we designed, where are we going to run the wires, and where are we going to put the switches? Where are we going to distribute? And we got into the nuts and bolts. Well, you can't go more than 300 feet from the switch because then you lose it with your Cat5 wires and da-da-da-da-da. So we really put together the backbone system that they're working with. We eventually then moved on to fiber optics. So, yeah, I was now that I'm thinking about it, I guess I was instrumental in
the computer.
In putting it, a lot more than I thought, because these other guys really started bringing the blocks to the wall into the room,
Yeah.
But that's interesting, Chris. Yeah, now that I look back at it, I had something to do with that too.
And the way you're describing it, then there's still that same cultural. There's still the PC guys and still the Apple guys to this day, and I think maybe they're even more. I don't know when they first came out how much you had to learn with the PC and the Apple, because even now some people are like, I don't know how to operate the Apple one, or I can't go back to PC. I don't like the way it works. But I think it's interesting how it's just continued to. Yeah, they both. I mean, Apple's huge now, and Windows.
My first Apple was an Apple IIc, which worked off of Pro-DOS, which was PCs ran on DOS, and then someone over in Apple World said, "Well, we got to kind of like make it like them. We got to compete with them." So they came out with Pro-DOS, which there was a certain amount of programming. It wasn't intuitive. But I found that challenge to be very good. I didn't think about DOS, because that was the business side, and I was into the creative side. As I moved up to the Apple IIgs, which was more of a graphical interface, which was moving toward the Lisa and toward what we have with Mac and MacBooks and stuff today, it was very intuitive. And I used to laugh and snark at the guys over on the PC labs because they were still playing with DOS. And I was hitting icons on my screen with the mouse, and I was moving faster, and I could do things quicker. And, of course, the application was doing for me what those guys were still trudging along doing with the keyboard. Well, of course, Bill Gates and the gang, they saw what Apple was doing, and Apple was moving faster and farther into the real world. So what did they do? They came up with Word, and they came up and they found their own graphical interfaces. And today there are differences. I still have people saying, "Oh, you should have stayed with Apple." Blah blah blah. I wouldn't go near a PC. I don't get into that because to me it is a tool, and I use it as such. And I could sit down and play an Apple, or play a PC. It's just out of convenience. I've stayed in the
Yes.
in the PC world. But
Definitely.
yeah, I guess there's still those differences out there.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you were making spreadsheets for the fire department.
Yeah, we're doing it for the fire department, and then also spreadsheets and stuff for in my job with inventory. Inventory control
Okay.
was big because I had a huge inventory of audiovisual stuff. With the fire department, everything went on spreadsheets for our parades, our fireworks, our 100th anniversary. I was able to use that computer as a tool to organize and then create sheets of paper with information that I could give out to the different committees, to the different officers. And it was just a real fast way to make a good graphic to get it out and to collect information and line it up and move it around and boom, 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 boom. And you didn't have to keep reinventing the wheels. If somebody new came into the parade or somebody wasn't going to be, you wanted to move someone from one division to another division, you could do it easily and bang, spit out a new spreadsheet. And
Yeah.
it just became a fast tool to get things done. And then, of course, it worked managing, I don't know how many thousands of pieces of equipment I had throughout the district. Because one of the things that I felt was important was to buy the best equipment that we could get years of service out of and to buy a lot of it so that as time went on, we could get away from this business of a teacher having to run 3 classrooms down to borrow something from someone and moving stuff back and forth. So every teacher had their own television, say, their own VHS to play back, have their own cassette to play back, to have their own record player to play back and do the things that they wanted to. They didn't have to, some very expensive pieces, of course, we had to move around. But the day-to-day equipment, so I had thousands of pieces of equipment on inventory. And computer, spreadsheets, and databases made that a snap.
So when did you start working for the fire department? Did you became a firefighter, right?
I was a volunteer fireman at the Southold Fire Department, and I joined that in October of 1972 on my 19th birthday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I went in as a probationary member in the Protection Engine Company. My dad, my uncles, my 2 uncles, and my grandfather were members of Protection Engine Company. And my great-grandfather, Michael Fisher, was, back in 1886, a charter member of Eagle Hook and Ladder in the Southold Fire Department. And back at that time, the Protection Engine House was over by the train station on Traveler Street, and they had a little hand. Eventually, they built a firehouse, and they had a hand pumper in there. And the Hook and Ladder was where the Grateful Deli is today. That was actually that was originally built by the Eagle Hook and Ladder Company, and that's where the hand-drawn ladder truck was. Which actually the ladder truck was built in Southold at a wheelwright's on the north side of 25 in the region of what used to be Albertson's store, and now it's the Blue Duck Bakery in the back of one of those houses along there across from 7-Eleven. There was a wheelwright in there, and they built carriages and farm implements and stuff out of wood, and they built the first ladder truck there in Southold for Eagle Hook and Ladder. And what you did at the time was you joined the fire company that was closest to your home, because you either rode a horse or you ran down to the firehouse. You didn't have a lot of cars and trucks back in those days at all. So you joined the fire company that was closest to your home. My family primarily was on the western end of the village, so we went into the engine company. My great-grandfather had a home just east of the 7-Eleven, so it was easier for him to run over to what's now the Grateful Deli. So he was in the Hook and Ladder Company. So I joined Protection Engine Company in 1972 as a probationary member, and I was there through the late 1980s and rose up to first assistant chief, was in the rescue squad, Also during that time, I got involved with becoming an emergency medical technician. And at that time, the fire departments here on the North Fork did not have ambulance services. The one that was atypical in that was Greenport. Greenport did have an ambulance in the fire service. But all the other fire departments depended on the DeFriest funeral home, which at that time, emergency medical services was not a thing. It was in its infancy in the early 1970s. And historically, it was the funeral homes because you had a hearse. And when you weren't carrying a body to a funeral, you could use that hearse to go out and pick up someone who had to be transported to the hospital lying down.
Right.
So it was normal for the funeral homes to provide the ambulance service to the communities. And that was typical throughout the country, and Southold Township was no different. So the DeFriest ambulance was part of the funeral home. We had one ambulance up in Mattituck. We had 2 ambulances here in Southold. And I started out as an emergency medical technician, and I was working part-time for the ambulance company. And that worked out well because I wasn't at school during the summer. I enjoyed, with my job, I enjoyed the same vacation periods as the students. So I had a lot of free time to do other things. So being in an EMT and working for the ambulance, and then as a volunteer being involved with the rescue squad at the Southold Fire Department, we took an old utility truck, which was called the rescue truck, but it was a collect-all, and it carried everything from boat anchors to oxygen tanks. Our little rescue squad, I was there when we took that truck and put a stretcher in the back and really fixed it up. It was 4-wheel drive. We could take it down on the beach. And it became a backup to DeFriest. And interestingly, David DeFriest was a member of my company. So we all kind of worked together. And the value of having a 4-wheel drive apparatus that could go down on the beach, it worked out. So we helped each other. Eventually, I became captain of the rescue squad at the fire department. Continued with being an EMT at DeFriest. Shortly, we saw the Orient Fire Department got an ambulance. We continued to go to East Marion, Mattituck and Cutchogue, and Southold. As time went on, the other departments also got ambulances. DeFriest sold the business. And we saw the emergency medical services matriculate out of the private sector into the volunteer fire departments. Now, that happened after I'd already left the fire department. I was involved with other activities in town. But we saw that change. I was a training officer. I was a safety officer. I started teaching EMT classes for Suffolk County in New York State. And that was night classes. And they came to me in 1976. I was already teaching first aid and CPR classes for the Red Cross, and I got a call. And they said, would you be interested in teaching EMT classes? I'm like, whoa, just like that? Oh, yeah. Well, we know about you out there doing these EMT, these first aid and CPR classes, and you're very active. You're well thought of. And we need someone out on the East End that can teach EMT classes. And I said, well, yeah, I'm honored. Wow, you're coming to me. And yeah, we'll set you all up. There's only one thing. You have a problem going to Shelter Island? No, I'll go to Shelter. Really? You don't mind taking the ferry over and doing the class on Shelter Island and come back? I said, no. I said, I know there's people over there. I said, they're fine people. I said, we get everybody home by midnight. I said, it's not a problem. I said, why is this an issue? Well, privately, he says, Joe Marino is the guy I'm talking to right now. And this was 1976. He says, honestly, he said, I cannot get any of our instructors from western Suffolk County to go all the way out to the end of eastern Long Island and then take a ferry boat to Shelter Island to teach a 3-hour class 2 nights a week.
Oh.
And he said, you're the first person I've talked to that says, like, oh, there's no problem. And I said, Joe, it's not. And that started a 26-year career evenings and weekends and stuff like that, where I was teaching EMT classes all around the North Fork.
Wow.
Greenport, Southold. I did classes out in Orient. Went back to Shelter Island many times. And for my faculty and staff, I brought in other members of the rescue squads here on the North Fork and Shelter Island to help me teach the class. And we had today we have a wonderful group of doctors associated with Eastern Long Island Hospital that would come in and give guest lectures. So from the fire service, I went into EMS. It's been great side careers on top of my basic work at the school over the years. And my work in radio and electronics, I was radio dispatcher for the fire department. I took the communications test for Suffolk County, and I was fortunate for 8 years. I worked as a part-time radio dispatcher for the police department during the 1980s, late 70s into the early 80s. And that, in turn, got me on to the Emergency Management Committee in the town of Southold that I'm still on as an emergency coordinator for communications. And it all, ties together with radio and electronics. Of course, the firefighting and the EMS certainly seems to be a sidetrack, but when you get into heart function, electricity is a very important part of keeping a normal sinus rhythm in your heartbeat. So there's even electronics involved with keeping our bodies running around. So that's my common denominator is electricity.
But when you were at the Southold Fire Department, did you have to go out on calls too
All the time.
All the time?
All the time, yeah. We handled all of the extrications, people getting in car accidents, and getting them out so that they could get into the defreezed ambulance to go to the hospital. We handled all the firefighting. We handled all the washdowns and the spills and hazardous materials and things like that. Of course, today, the Southold Fire Department, all the departments on the North Fork also handle the EMS. So you've got your ambulances, your AEMTs, your paramedics, and they are supplemented with Stony Brook University's paramedics additionally. But we're still doing what we always did, to go out to protect life and property. And as much as it changes, it stays the same.
And do you feel over that time, was there any specific event that stood out to you that was really bad in terms of a call that came in that sticks with you?
As I look back over the years, there certainly were, we had bad calls. Yeah. We were always called out to you when it was the worst possible time that you were having in your life. And it's the same way today. These are the worst moments of your life when you call us. And we're coming to help you get through that time. And there were many tragedies that I had the opportunity to step into. I can't say that any one of them was more highlighted than another. This comes under the term of war stories. And I don't think we want to go there. But, there was some pretty dramatic calls and scenes that I went into. And really many of them were when we were working for the ambulance company, before the fire departments got into EMS. And now the volunteers experience those moments.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. But we don't want to go there.
No.
we want to keep this podcast light and on a very, very positive note.
No, we're going to change the topic now, but...
you're getting into the heavy stuff now, Chris.
So you're the president of the Railroad Museum of Long Island, right?
I am, yes.
And I'm curious, so when did you become interested in trains? Was that as you were you a kid at the time?
This is really interesting because I have no interest in trains at all. Yeah, this may be a shock to our podcast audience out there that knows me, because I can be pretty vociferous as the president of the Railroad Museum of Long Island. Yeah, I have no interest in trains at all. So now to tell the story. My parents bought my son Benjamin his first HO train set when he was 9 years old. I really had no interest in trains.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest memory I have of trains was we had a big snow, maybe in the late 1950s, very early 1960s. And the Long Island Railroad was using a snowplow. Actually, the snowplow that you can see outside of our museum here, Jaws, on 4th Street in Greenport. And the Long Island Railroad was pushing that thing out through the hinterland from Peconic into Southold, opening up the railroad tracks after this big blizzard that we'd had. And I can remember to this day my father picking me up. The drifts were so high, he had boots, high waders on. Picked me up and put me on his shoulders and walked me through the snow up Tucker's Lane to the railroad tracks so that we could see this snowplow that's outside the museum today come through and open up the Long Island Railroad. I remember that. I lived near the railroad tracks my entire life. The trains would go back and forth, but I never ran out to look at them. You know, I was playing, doing whatever I was doing, and it was just the train was in the background going back and forth. My son, on the other hand, really loved the train set that my parents gave him. And it was something that he and I could get together on because we had electricity to run the trains.
Yeah.
So we had some wiring involved and some electricity. It was an opportunity to build a train table. So, and my son, who's very handy to this day and carried on doing the same kind of work that I did, we had good times building that train set and going out and getting more trains. And, you know, the first layout I helped him put together. He learned how to solder wires together and do the wiring on the train. It was a father-son thing the first time out. And it wasn't long after that he was like, Dad, I got this. And he did it on his own. And that challenge was good. And he made beautiful train layouts 3 or 4 times. Well, that got us into the trains. And I was working for the ferry boat company, as I had mentioned earlier. And on Friday nights and Saturdays, I worked in Greenport directing traffic, getting people on and off the boats. And Chris Toludo, who lived here in the village, was the president of the museum. And he knew I was an electrician, and they needed an electrician.
Yeah.
And he would come by and he'd pester me during the summertime when I was working at the fair. Why don't you come over? We got work for you to do. We got this to do. We got that to do. We really need somebody with your skills in the Railroad Museum. And I'm like, yeah, Chris, I'm doing my own electronic stuff. I don't have time for that. Well, now my son's really into trains. So again, for something that we could do together as father and son, we started coming down Wednesday evenings to 4th Street here in Greenport with Bob and Lil White and the Monahans and people that were working here to build this museum up. And this was, I want to say, like 1995. And it just started out helping to build displays, helping with the carpentry work, with the painting. And then as we started to develop the interior of the building, I could see where some stage lighting and electricity comes back into this museum picture again.
Yeah.
And my son would work with me, and we wired up the building, and we put in the lighting, and it was just like one step at a time. And we got involved, and then the Railroad Museum of Long Island was given the property in Riverhead to the museum from the Nassau-Suffolk Lumber Company. And, of course, they had all these buildings up there that had to be torn down. And, again, we get into electricity. So my son and I were asked to come up to Riverhead, to the other site of the museum, and to help with the demolition and, the electrical work up there. And my son got together with Chris and the guys, and they were working on Engine 39. So he was getting into using the oxyacetylene torch and learning metalworking over on the engine, and I was doing electrical work. And as time developed and went on, we just got more and more involved until in 2000, I was asked to take a position on the board of directors. And I still wasn't a big train guy. I was learning about the Long Island Railroad and the history. I was learning about railroads and trains through osmosis, if nothing else. And, of course, now that you're working in a museum, people ask you questions. Well, I had to do some research, and I had to read up on this so I could give them an answer. And what has really driven me with the museum is not so much the trains. I could have been with any museum, but it's the history. We go back to the history buff, and the people. We go back to Benjamin Franklin, bringing people together to do things. And that's what I really enjoy, the challenge of taking individuals and groups of people with disparate skills, interests, and bringing them together under the tent. And then we create something really cool. And that's what I've been doing since my retirement. I retired on October 31st, 2008, and it had been on October 22nd, 2008, that I was elected as president of the Railroad Museum.
Wow.
So for the last 15 years, I've just been having a ball. It was like I stepped out of one project, one job that I loved, into another project, another job that I love. And it's just bringing people together to do really neat things. That's what we've been doing.
Wonderful. And that reminds me when you talked about your parents getting your son a railroad, that reminded me of, I kind of had a similar thing with my grandfather and my uncle, and he kind of got him set up, and then he got me set up with a train layout and would get me stuff, and that kind of got me interested in trains, though I don't have space for it today, but I still have them all stored away. But it reminded me of that. And do you feel that, you said you could work at any train museum like that, but do you feel that you've grown more fond of trains since 2008? Because you said, before that, you're like, I wasn't interested in that.
No, well, I wasn't. Well, I never hated trains, or it wasn't a negative thing for me. But what my interest in trains is how railroads built the country, how the Long Island Railroad and the associated little railroads that came before what we know today as the Long Island Railroad built Long Island, Nassau and Suffolk County.
Yes.
Our island today is what it is because of the Long Island Railroad in 1834 to 1844 when it got to Greenport. And then all of the years that it's been with us, 2024 is the 190th anniversary of the Long Island Railroad running around on this island. It is the 180th anniversary of the first train getting to Greenport in April of 1844. We do not, as a society or as a culture, appreciate what that railroad has done. We live, we learn, we entertain, we enjoy ourselves in Nassau and Suffolk, in Queens, Brooklyn. Today, what we can do, because the Long Island Railroad built, it was the infrastructure. Even our agriculture. We don't think about it, but because the railroad got to Greenport, because it was here primarily to get people to Boston, and after the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad was built, all of a sudden now you don't need the Long Island Railroad anymore. You could go from New York City to Boston in a one-seat ride. You didn't have to take a boat from Greenport over to Rhode Island to catch another train. And it was like, Long Island Railroad is basically bankrupt. So they had to look around. What can we do to keep this thing going? We've got it. Well, hey, somebody got the bright idea. People in New York City want fresh vegetables. Now, at that point in time, in the 1800s, this was subsistence farming, and this was farming that you sold to your neighbors, but there was no idea of a commodity being sold to the metropolis of New York City and expanding to the rest of the country or even the world from little eastern Long Island. And there were vast tracts in the center of the island that were not being used for agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now because the railroad's on hard times, this business of taking people to Boston's not working, they looked around and they said, what if we took vegetables from the small farms on the East End? And at that time, there was no Montauk branch. There was, they weren't looking at Southampton and East Hampton. This was specifically from Brooklyn to Greenport. But what if we took the foodstuffs from those farms out there and brought them into New York and sold them at market, and we opened up a new area for the farmers to sell to? Mm-hmm. And now the farmers came back with money, and they could improve their lives here, and they could expand their farms and make more. And it started the whole agricultural economy by the Long Island Railroad being the first in the world to do what we call today TOFC, or trailers on flat cars, in the 1850s. This was unheard of.
Wow.
They'd come out here with a flat car. The farmers with horse and carriage would take their foodstuffs down to the train station. They would load them onto the flat cars and tie them down. And the farmers would get into a passenger car and ride with their stuff into the city. And they'd be there in 2 hours, as faster than it is today to go on a Long Island Railroad to New York. They would unload the carriages, and teamsters in the city would clump, take them down to market. The farmers would be there all day. They would sell this fresh vegetable to the restaurants and the people that wanted fresh food. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of the day, they'd put the empty wagons back on the train, and the farmers had their money from sales, and the railroad in the dark would bring them home. And this would go on, different farmers, different days, but all of a sudden this opened up an economy that was unheard of. Well, as you can see, this blossomed to the point that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the railroad actually hired people to promote farmland, or what was considered the Pine Barrens, not farmland. They said, listen, you can come away from the South Shore and the North Shore into the center of this island, and you can have excellent farms along the railroad tracks. And then after you've grown it, we'll take your commodity in and go to brokers and the trade. And this whole economy of agriculture, to the point where we were the number one potato producing area in this country at one time. Mm-hmm. And our potatoes went from the Caribbean all the way up into the Maritimes along the East Coast. We fed the eastern part of the United States with our potatoes, cauliflower, cabbage, all of the commodities that we think about in trading came from here, and the railroad was able to create that entire business, industry, agri-industry, and economy. We don't think about that. And today it's agritainment, but we wouldn't have agritainment today, and the fun things that we do here with vineyards and Christmas tree farms and corn mazes and all the things that we do, if it hadn't been for the railroad creating a commodity-based industry right here, because they couldn't take passengers to Boston anymore in 1850.
That was cut off because they didn't need it anymore.
Sure. Well, right from 1844 until roughly 1849, 1850, people that wanted to go back and forth to Boston for business or to send packages and things, you would get on a ferry in Manhattan, and you would put across the East River to Brooklyn, where you'd catch your train. And your train would bring you out through Brooklyn to Jamaica, and then on out through Hicksville and through the main line, through the Pine Barrens to Greenport. Now, and you could get here in less than 2 hours from Brooklyn, which was rocket speed for those people back in the day. If
I mean, it's still it's
yeah,
faster than what it is today.
you're absolutely correct. You'd get to Greenport, and you would get off the train, and you would step onto a sailing ship or a steamship, which would take you across the Sound over to Rhode Island, where you picked up the Old Colony Railroad, which took you up to Boston. You could still do the entire trip from the time you left Manhattan till the time you were in your hotel room in Boston in 11 hours. Prior to that, you would take anywhere from 2 to 5 days, depending on the weather and the road conditions, to take a carriage and horses from Manhattan across into Connecticut, across Connecticut, Rhode Island, and up to Boston. I mean, you could do what you had to do in 3 or 4 days or more in 11 hours. I mean, this was technology at its best at the time. Of course, when I give my talks, I like to compare the mid 1800s to our .com, burst and bubble and boom, or boom, burst and bubble that we had back in the early 2000s and the late 90s. Everybody was putting their money into railroads. If you had $5, you invested it in a railroad. It was hot, hot, hot. Well, the people up through New England and Connecticut, they wanted to invest their money, and as time went on, we had hydraulic cement developed so that we could build the piers, so that we could build bridges across rivers and creeks, and that's what kept people, industrialists, from building from New York directly to Boston. We didn't have the metallurgy. We could not build strong bridges in the early 1800s. All of that science was happening. It was being developed. And it was the Portland cement that was created in Germany, and it was our metallurgy here and around the world where we could build stronger steel and castings so that we could take the weight from one pier to the other, from one side of the river to the other, that allowed us to get over the Connecticut River, the Thames in New London, and the marshy areas that ran along. Historically, if you look at most of our railroad lines around the country, they follow a river. They follow a waterway. And they follow that because it's fairly flat. You don't want to have to run a train up high, and you don't want to have it come flying down on the other side of the hill. So you try to keep your grade steady and flat. And where did you find those? Not up in the hills and the mountains, but along the rivers. Also, that's where the trails were. We went from animal traffic to foot traffic, from foot traffic to horse traffic, from horse traffic to cars and trains. And in there, you had your canals and your rivers, and people moved things by water. So there's a reason that you find these things. Well, that would have been the way to go in the early 1800s, but they couldn't get there from here because we couldn't ford over those rivers. We didn't have the technology to build the bridges. So they said, hey, we've got a fairly flat plain through the center of Long Island. We don't have a high grade that we've got to chug up and worry about coming down on the other side. And we have boats. I mean, up until that time, everything moved by boat, by sailboats.
People would take a boat from Brooklyn to Greenport before the railroad.
Sure, or to Boston.
Yeah.
But it took days. Took days, where the train could move you along so much faster. So these folks said, let's hook up with shipping. Let's go from Manhattan to Brooklyn on a ferry boat. We'll run that train out to Greenport. And then we'll get back on the boat, get over to the other side. We don't have the same problem going from Rhode Island up to Boston that we have going from New York over to London. We don't have all the fjords and things that we have to get over. So we had a boat, train. And you could do it 11 hours. Now, not to digress, but I should go back. As our country, as 13 colonies and 13 states, was growing and becoming successful, people in Boston needed to communicate on so many different levels with people in South Carolina. so much of our textiles, the things that we needed to make clothing, came from the South. It would come up to the North to where we had our factories, and we would produce and manufacture, and then we'd want to ship it back down to sell because the people down South wanted to wear pants and shirts.
Yes.
But we needed the raw materials, and money was going back and forth. We were a burgeoning economy that was growing. So we always want to go faster. Mm-hmm. The speed of our computers, we want them to go faster. We don't want to wait there while something low. Boom, you want to push that key and have it. Well, it was no different back then than it is today. People had money, and they started to invest in this new technology from England and from Europe, the train, the railroad. And when we think about this investment, we think about the need for people to communicate from Boston to South Carolina. What we end up with is a chain. And think of the railroads at the time in the early 1800s as a chain with links. And you started with a little railroad with investors, very small, maybe 50 miles or so, coming out of Charleston, South Carolina. And that would connect with another railroad, another link in the chain. And these little railroads all the way up the East Coast to New York. And each link in the chain, and you could literally go from one railroad to the next, and it was incremental, but you started to move people and material and money faster, going from one link to the next link, from one little railroad to the next. Well, when you got to New York, it was like the last hop was to get to Boston.
Yep.
All right, and this is what we've been talking about here on the podcast is how do we get from New York to Boston? How do we get New York and Boston, which were two very large sites in our country at the time, as was Washington and Philadelphia. But wow, so much business was going between Boston and New York. Mm-hmm. It really wanted to connect. There was a demand there. And all these chain links were being built to come up. That's how come we ended up with the Long Island Railroad. It is a link. The Long Island Railroad is one link in a chain that ran from Charleston, South Carolina to Boston to move people, to move merchandise, to move money. So this is our link in the chain. Now, when those investors and those business people were able to use the technology of bridges and concrete piers and had the money to buy the property along the shoreline of Long Island Sound, they built their own railroad over there. And that was the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. Now, all of a sudden, you could step into Grand Central Terminal, get on your train, put your bag up over the top of your seat, and you had roughly a 11-hour ride through Connecticut, over the bridges, over the rivers, through the woods to Boston. And you didn't have to hop a ferry, move all your stuff, take your train ride, hop onto a boat in Greenport, take a boat ride, and then get back. All right, so everything, we always want to get easier. We always want to make it smoother, easier, faster. So the New York, New Haven, and Hartford wiped out the Long Island Railroad. And now, you've got this thing here. You've got the foundation and the infrastructure. And they looked around and they said, well, we've got this investment. That's how we got into agriculture. That's how we got into commuters.
Were there commuters before the New York, New Haven, Hartford?
Yes.
To Greenport and...
Not to Greenport.
That was just to stop.
Remember, it took us 10 years to get to Greenport. There were several financial emergencies, not depressions, but scares, if you will. So the money would dry up. And you needed investors, and you needed them to put the money in to build the railroad. So it was fits and starts. Interestingly enough, when the Long Island Railroad began, they didn't even own the railroad. When they first received their charter from the state of New York to build from the foot of the East River in Brooklyn to Greenport and or Sag Harbor, the state legislature said, all right, we'll let you terminate in one or both, Sag Harbor and Greenport, but you can start out in Brooklyn. All right, now we've got permission from the state to build our railroad, and this is in 1834. But how do we get through Brooklyn? Because Brooklyn was already a city unto itself. It was already streets and cobblestones, and it had its own vitality and thing going on there. All right, so we will rent, lease the railroad that had been built by the Brooklyn and Jamaica Railroad Company. That's how we'll start. Because what had happened was those investors had built from the East River up Atlantic Avenue and to Jamaica. And they were going to have their own little railroad. But by the time they got done building the infrastructure, they didn't have the money to buy the cars or the locomotives. Now, timing is everything. And place and time. Here comes the Long Island Railroad, and they're looking around. Well, this is what we want to do. We can go to Greenport. How are we going to get started? Wait a minute. They've got the road, but they don't have the cars. So we will come in. We will lease the Brooklyn-Jamaica Railroad and go right down Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. We'll bring the cars, and we'll bring the little locomotives, and we will start our railroad. And that's the first step or the first group of miles. And that's how they were able to start so quickly. Then they had to build. The Long Island Railroad had to keep building from Jamaica to Greenport. And that's where we run into these ups and downs with the finances. So it took them 10 years to get here. In the meantime, everybody's working on metallurgy. Everybody's working on ways to create piers and do all the things that they did eventually by 1850 to make the railroad a one-seat ride to Boston, which created a hardship for our Long Island Railroad. But then in turn, we've talked about the agricultural aspect. As soon as the railroad got to Jamaica, using the Brooklyn-Jamaica Railroad property with Long Island Railroad personnel, cars, and engines, Jamaica and points east of that was farmland. As we moved into the... Yeah,
there was nothing really in between.
It was not the megalopolis that we think of today.
Small little one-light railroad stuff.
Well, they didn't even have one stoplight in town. I mean, you literally were in farmland. By the time you were out into Jamaica and toward Hicksville and out into that area, this was the center of the island. Historically, our population centers were along the North Shore, up through Stony Brook, Oyster Bay, Port Jefferson, and along the Sound so that people could use ships and move in and out. And you had an economy in fishing, in shellfishing, oyster works, clamming, everything that we think of today as a secondary industry or as something that we do as entertainment to go out and get a bushel of clams during the summertime. There's a way of life for those people. So you had your population centers along the North Shore and along the South Shore. That's where people lived because they could get on the water and they could take a boat, they could take a sailboat, they could row, eventually have steamboat, and they could communicate that way. So when you got up in Hicksville in Jamaica, there wasn't much going on. It was farmland. It was prairie. Literally, there were prairies through Nassau County. So people got the idea, and it was promoted by developers, workers, business people, financial people. Build your homes out on the prairies of Long Island. Create new communities to the east. Have your wives and your children grow up in this wonderful nature, fresh air, room to play. Have your garden, have your own fresh vegetables. And then, Dad, you get on the train in the morning and we'll take you into the filth of Manhattan. You do your business and come home at night. And you don't expose your family to
the whole
city
environment.
Right. And that worked. That's what built Long Island, because now we had the mobility provided by the Long Island Railroad. We didn't have a Long Island Expressway.
No.
We didn't have cars. We didn't have buses. But all of a sudden, we had this conveyance. Now, that commuter business helped to provide money to continue building toward Boston, i.e., to the deep harbor of Greenport. They looked at Sag Harbor at the time, and they said, we've got to get across the Shinnecock Canal and through those marshes. We have the hills to go up and down in Southampton. It's easier, it's faster, and it's cheaper for us to go to Greenport. Now, the state gave those 12 good and tried men the opportunity. You can go to Sag Harbor, you can go to Greenport. Well, they're no different. They took the path of least resistance, which was right through the Pine Barrens, right through the prairies of Nassau County. But it took them 10 years to build it, through Yaphank, out into Riverhead. And of course, when they hit Riverhead, now you're into fertile farmland. And even though we were subsistent farmers, it's interesting because there was resistance here. There was resistance.
Even back in the 1800s.
Oh, absolutely, because now you've got this railroad, which has this fire-breathing locomotive coming through, and it's like, it upsets the chickens in the morning. It upsets the cows, and the cows wouldn't give milk because the train's going through and ringing a bell and blowing a whistle and making a rumbling noise, and the horses and everybody in the pasture was getting into an uproar, and they'd come out early. They'd come out all times of the day. They'd hit cows on the tracks. They'd run into the farmers with, it was like, wait a minute, we don't need this. This is for the rich people in New York City to get to the rich people in Boston. You had that whole scene going on. So there were stories, true, that when the train got out here in the early days, they'd go out and they'd grease the tracks. And God forbid the train should hit some farmer's cow. That cow was important. That was that's how he got his milk for his family and had a little bit of economy going on here. The side note to that is when we found out that the train would hit the cow, to keep peace in the world, the railroad would pay the farmer for the death of his cow.
To get a new one.
Yeah, but... this happened a few times. All of the farmers kind of got wise to this and said, wait a minute, if I've got a cow that's toward the end of its life and it's not giving milk, if I take it up to railroad tracks and it happens to get run over by the train, the railroad will give me money to buy a new cow.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds pretty harsh, but that was the reality of life. Everything has a time of life and death, and this cow couldn't give milk anymore. Well, rather than put it out of its misery or maybe make steak out of it,
yeah.
Now we had this new way to get some money from the big bad railroad. Mm-hmm. So that was a thing. And pretty soon the railroad created cow catchers.
Oh.
This is like a little snowplow style apparatus that they'd put on the front of the locomotive, and now as it would come along, and those locomotives weren't going fast. It wasn't, smash into the cow.
Yeah.
It would gently push the cow off the tracks.
Oh, wow.
It would. And they were called cow catchers for that purpose. So, as you can see, there's a little cat and mouse game that goes on throughout all of these levels. This is why I like to say when I'm giving a talk, all of the shenanigans that we saw in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, where there were tremendous land grabs, there was tremendous politics and give and take with the public trust as these railroads were built across the country to come together in Salt Lake City, or in Salt Lake there in Utah, for the driving of the final Golden Spike. Every shenanigan that went on there after the Civil War went on here on Long Island. So you had this, and this is what I love about the railroad. This is what I love about being in the museum, because we uncover these stories, and they're really human interest stories. It's what we do as humans. And it is such a rich history, as we're going into 190 years of this shenanigans, if you will. It's just a great story. And when you think about the fact that what we have today was all built from this railroad, it's fascinating. It's fantastic. And those are the things that we like to celebrate at the museum. And those are the things we like to share with the people because they don't realize this all went before them today.
Yeah. They just look at it as this, oh, there's this track here, and
it's the railroad Long Islanders love to hate. You know, they love it because it can get them to work, it can bring them home, it can take you into the city to see a show, and you can do good things. But we also hate it for the same reason. We hate it because it takes us to work. We hate it because it's late getting us home at night. So it's I like to say it's the railroad we all love to hate.
And with the museum, when exactly did the museum start?
We go back to late 1970s. Ron Zeal, who was a prolific writer and photographer, lived over in Bridgehampton, and he was just wondered and a big proponent of the history of the Long Island Railroad. He loved not only our railroad, but railroads throughout the country. He saw an opportunity for the bicentennial in 1976. The Long Island Railroad, when it got out of steam operations in 1955 and went over to all diesel service and electric service, they got rid of the dirty, smelly steam locomotives. Mm-hmm. They offered to each of the island boroughs, Brooklyn, Queens, of New York City, they offered to Nassau County and they offered to Suffolk County a working steam engine. Now, Brooklyn and Queens said no. They didn't want it. Nassau County accepted it, and that is steam locomotive 35, which resides at the Oyster Bay Railroad Museum today. Mm. Suffolk County, at the time, we didn't have a legislature. We had supervisors, 10 supervisors were in the steering position for the county. So we're not getting into a railroad. We want nothing to do with it. And just as Brooklyn and Queens said, no, thank you, Suffolk County said to the railroad, thanks, but keep your steam locomotive. Ward Melville, who was a great proponent of maintaining the history of Long Island, saw it as an important piece of our history, as we've been talking about through this podcast. And he said, let me have it. Don't scrap locomotive 39. Bring it over here, and we will put it at the what was the Long Island Carriage Museum in Stony Brook, and we will give it a prominent position so people can see it. Nassau County chose to put their locomotive in Salisbury Park, which became Eisenhower Park, and it to this day, they put theirs on display at Eisenhower Park, and Ward Melville put up on the hill in Stony Brook at the Carriage Museum, Engine 39. And now it's the Long Island Museum, and they do much more than carriages. A wonderful museum there in Stony Brook. Along come Ron Zeal. And in celebration of the bicentennial, now, these locomotives were placed in 1955. We are looking at the bicentennial in 1976. These things would have been sitting there for 20 years. They were still in very good shape. They had been run up until the day the railroad gave them to Nassau and Suffolk County. And it was Ron's opinion that, hey, if we get that thing off the hill in Stony Brook and take it to Riverhead, our volunteers will restore it and get it operational. And wow, we can run this locomotive, the steam locomotive, all over the Long Island Railroad. We can go out to Montauk. I mean, it was only 20 years ago you were running it. Let us fix it up. Let us get it out on the road. And wow, what a boon to tourism. People will come here from all over the country to ride behind our steam locomotives. So Ron created a volunteer group called the Steam Locomotive 39, or Steam Engine 39 Restoration Committee. And over those years, from the early 70s until 1980, Ron was able to negotiate ownership of the locomotive from the museum at Stony Brook to the restoration group. This becomes the foundation for the Railroad Museum of Long Island. Okay. This is the beginnings. Because there was no Railroad Museum of Long Island. There was only the Engine 39 Restoration Committee. They brought the locomotive to Riverhead, where the Long Island Railroad leased or licensed to the organization the space that we have there now. And those volunteers started readying the locomotive to go out and run. Now, as time goes and cultures change, technology changes, in those 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, the Long Island Railroad had taken away all the infrastructure that's necessary to support steam locomotives. We had no more coaling towers. We had no more water towers. Every town would have a water tower. There was one here in Greenport. There was one in Mattituck. There was one in Riverhead, because you need to fill the locomotive with water to keep making steam. Yes. To make the pistons go back and forth and move this thing, you needed coal. The erecting shops, the large shops, had been converted over for diesel maintenance. Many of the people that knew how to work on these locomotives had retired, passed on. So our cadre of skilled people to operate these things is shrinking. We don't have the infrastructure to support it. And quite honestly, by the 1980s, the Pennsylvania Railroad and that culture of steam had gone away and were now replaced by the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. The MTA had come into play in the mid-'60s, and by 1968, there was no more Pennsylvania Railroad. The Long Island Railroad was entirely owned by the state of New York through the MTA. Now, the MTA is basically a bureaucratic taxing district, if you will, to support all of these functions of transit. Everything, as I said earlier, from bridges and tunnels to subways, buses, and the railroads. They're not interested in running steam trains. You're stepping back into, prehistoric dinosaur times. Ron had a real problem in getting a lot of support to run this steam locomotive all over Long Island. It's also very expensive to do these repairs and to bring the train up to a level of certification. And now we have so much more certification and oversight than we did in the 1800s. We have to comply with the FRA. We have to comply with the Long Island Railroad, the MTA, all the rules and the regulations for safe operation of a steam locomotive. And Ron had a lot of resistance to running this thing all over the place. That, in turn, created tensions within the group. There were those in his group that saw diesel operations being the only way to go to get, and they were talking about a tourist line from Greenport to Riverhead. And one of the requirements that had been placed on the group was, well, you need a diesel engine as a protect engine so that if that steam locomotive breaks down on our line, because Ron and his group didn't own the tracks from Greenport to Riverhead or anywhere on Long Island. They belonged to the people of the state of New York through the MTA. Said, you need to have a diesel engine, which we know will work, and we're familiar with that, to go out and drag this thing off the tracks if it breaks down. Because we still have to run a railroad. So now Ron had his differences. We should go diesel. No, we need to go steam and da-da-da-da-da-da. So amongst these conversations came another small Banty group that said, let us create a museum in Greenport. And that group formed as the Railroad Museum of Long Island in 1990. Ron and his group were still going strong, and there was a lot of cross-training there. I mean, many people that belonged to the Railroad Museum of Long Island were also members of the Engine 39 Restoration Committee. So there was a symbiosis there. And, of course, part of the idea was, well, if we do get the steam locomotive operational, to have the museum in Greenport, now we've got a place to sell tickets out of. We've got a place to people to come to see the museum. Then you get back on the train. You go back to Riverhead to your car. And everything came together. And it was a good idea. It's still a good idea to this day. From a visionary standpoint, this all played together. So the Railroad Museum of Long Island was formed in 1990. Between that time and 1993, negotiations were held with the Long Island Railroad and the MTA, and our group have a long-term license to have the site of the original Long Island Railroad freight house on 4th Street. Now, during this time, what we know as the Maritime Museum today was still being used existentially as a passenger terminal. They weren't selling tickets in there. There was a little restaurant going on in there. It was still a place people could go in and wait for the train.
This was in the 90s.
This was in the 1990s, right? Late 1980s into the early 1990s. So our group wasn't looking at the passenger terminal at all. We were looking at the freight house. And by its own nature, it has a large open expanse for freight to come in and out of. So it does, to this day, make a wonderful exhibit hall for a museum. By 1993, we were open. And by 1993, the interpersonal issues and things that were going on over at the Restoration Committee, it kind of imploded on itself, and it was no more. So now you have the steam locomotive and the cars and the license of the Long Island Railroad site in Riverhead. What do you do with it? When a 501c3 organization fails, the assets and everything basically go to the state of New York for disposition. And they look around for another like museum or nonprofit organization that could benefit from the spoils, if you will, of the group that has failed. So the New York State Supreme Court cast their eye about, well, it's not easy to move a steam locomotive that's 120,000 pounds. You don't pick it up, throw it in the back of a pickup truck and take it upstate. So wisely, the judges said, wait a minute, we've got this railroad museum in Greenport, and they've been around for 3 years. They've got a provisional charter from the state education department. They're doing some good things out there. Let's give all the assets of Ron Zeal's organization to the Railroad Museum of Long Island. And that's how we, to this day, have a foot in Riverhead, and our other foot is firmly set in Greenport. And over the years, we have developed where the actual museum, if you think of a Smithsonian, where you can go in, you can look at exhibits, you can learn the history and the educational part, is here in the large exhibit hall in the Freight House on 4th Street in Greenport. Riverhead, because most of our large equipment that needs tremendous amount of maintenance year after year is in Riverhead, turns out to be a working site where construction, restoration, maintenance goes on. It's much more hands-on from the very beginning. So what has developed on the property in Riverhead is we have things that people can climb on, things that people can touch, things that people push a button, something happens, things to see. We have the World's Fair train from the 1964-65 World's Fair, Long Island Railroad Pavilion. You can come up and ride on that. We have become the interactive site of the museum at Riverhead. The large collections are there. Our back shops, our machine shops, our wood shops. We've also been able to build our train layouts there because we have more space physically. Yes. And the space that we have here at Greenport, we have committed to educational and museum exhibits. So we market the entire museum as, come out. During the summer, you can take the Long Island Railroad Greenport Scoot. You start in Riverhead, you go out to Greenport, and then it'll bring you back to Riverhead. You get a train ride on the Long Island Railroad. You get to see the educational exhibit portion at Greenport, walk around the 4-acre historic site, which this is another thing many of our podcast listeners may not know, that the buildings of the Long Island Railroad passenger station, which is the Seaport Museum, the freight house, and the turntable, and all that property is a historic transportation district. From 3rd Street to 4th Street, that section, including what is the fishing dock, is all part of the historic transportation district at Greenport. We are on the New York State and the Federal Registry of Historic Places. So this is a very important historic economy generating area,
Yes.
as well as being the parking lot for the Hampton Jitney, continuing to be the terminal for Greenport, Long Island Railroad coming back
Yes.
and forth, and also the North Ferry Company's Shelter Island. So it's a transportation hub, it's a historic site, and it continues to this day, 180 years later, being very, very important to the economy and the transportation on Eastern Long Island and for all the people living here. So we encourage people to come to Riverhead, leave your car, take the train during the summer out to Greenport, experience the historic site, run over, grab some lunch, get back on the train, come back to Riverhead, and then spend a few hours at Riverhead seeing the larger collections to experience the interactive part. So we have two very disparate sites or plants, campuses, one strictly for education and absorbing information about the history of the Long Island Railroad and all railroads on Long Island, and one where you can really have fun and interact with a lot of neat equipment and stuff that you normally wouldn't get allowed to touch and get involved with. So between the two sites, everything has grown up from the origins of Ron Zeal and his vision of having the steam locomotive, which I don't think we'll ever see it actually run here because there's just
A lot of hurdles.
too many requirements and lack of supporting infrastructure to run it. And but that's another story.
Yeah. And with the museum, since the 90s, have you seen growth for it and more support for it over the years?
Yes, it's been a steady growth up until the time of COVID, and that hit everybody.
Yeah.
I'm happy to say that 4 years later, we're back up and running really well. We have broken attendance records. 33-year attendance records were broken this year, not once but twice, 3, 4 times. The demand, visitors want to come and see the museums. So particularly at Riverhead, for the first time ever, we've remained open on Saturdays until the very, very end of the year. I think by its nature, it is educational. Greenport does not get the demand that Riverhead does, simply because it's where you come to think and learn, where Riverhead is more fun.
More interactive. And
Sure it is.
I remember I always went there as a kid. I don't think I ever went to the one in Greenport till I was much older, but I always enjoyed the Riverhead one as a kid.
And that's what we see as a demographic. The people who come to see the museum, and again, our numbers are increasing every year at Greenport as well. The people who come to Greenport it's an older demographic. It's people who remember riding the train. It's employees of the railroad who want to come and see the artifacts and the memories that were made. It is definitely a very different clientele at Greenport than what it is at Riverhead. Riverhead is a lot of families with younger children. Not that we still get families with young children at Greenport too, but they tend to gravitate to Riverhead. Both sites are very successful, and we see growth at both of the plants or both of the campuses. And there's no reason that it will not continue. We're very excited here in Greenport. We've been working over the last 4 to 5 years with the village, the North Ferry Company, with the museum, the Maritime Museum. We're going to see in the next year, 18 months, the outside 2 years, a great change down on that historic property. The ferry line is going to be moving from Wigan Street, or a large part of the ferry line is going to move from Wigan Street onto what is now a parking lot down there. You're going to have lanes where you load from the lanes onto the boat. On the south side of the tracks, you're going to see a complete rethinking of that parking lot where Hampton Jitney comes in and out. There's going to be more parking spaces over there. It's going to be regraded and changed around, so the spaces that we're losing on the north side of the tracks will be picked up and a few more on the south side. The entire traffic patterns in the area are going to change. And part of this is a reimagining of the property around our site, the Freight House. So we're going to get more green space down there. Our parking is going to improve. There's going to be much more family friendly to get there and not have to deal around the ferry line and people zipping in and around out there.
Yeah.
So we're very excited to see that whole project come to fruition and finish up. The other big thing for Greenport with us, we worked closely with the Greenport Rotary Club on the Greenport Express, which was Frank Fields, one of his Peconic County miniature railroad trains, which has been successfully set up over in Moores Woods. It's a beautiful 1,500-foot ride. It is, in the sense of being important to the village of Greenport, a historic train set. This is a train that Frank ran for many years at his property on Webb Street and off of Washington Avenue. Many fond memories were made with those trains on Frank's property. And for the Greenport Rotary to take that train set, restore it, and bring it to life again, it's just a beautiful building we have there with toilets, with a classroom area, a safe place where you can board and get off and on the train, storage. You open up the doors on each end, and the train runs through that building. Been very well thought out, and that's very exciting because we see that opening sometime in 2024. It's really ready to go. That is going to be, again, hand in glove, associated with partnership with us, and we can send people from the Railroad Museum to the train ride, and people that are taking the train ride can come over and see the museum. So these are very exciting things that we see as growing the interest in the railroad, in railroads in general, and it all ties into education and teaching people about all the things we've been talking about here. The growth of Long Island and its subsistence and its being what it is today all came from trains.
Definitely. And is that more like a partnership over by Moores?
Well, it's when it's operational, it will be completely under the aegis of the Village of Greenport. Just as the carousel is today, or the ice skating rink is today, the skate park. This is going to be another feature of Greenport Village, its recreation department, and the village itself. So as far as a partnership, it's not a partnership, but we complement each other. And, we had an opportunity. We helped with the Rotary Club, our personnel, with guiding and getting the engine restored to good operation. Bob Kloss and his family at Ted's Auto Body in Peconic Cutchogue area, they did the beautiful restoration of the bodies and painting them. Riverhead Brake Service did the mechanical work. We helped get everything moved back and forth and get onto the tracks, get it operational. So we did in October have its inaugural test runs, so we know that it goes around very nicely. And at this point, we've done everything we can over the last 5 years on that project. We've turned it over to the village, the operation, and Tony Cassone, who for many years operated with Frank and did his mechanical work up there. We're on to the next chapter with that. And we're very excited to see that open and be operational. And not so much a partnership, but we complement each other, trains to trains.
And I was curious because you said you have those other plans coming up with how the ferry's going to move so it won't be as much in the way, and you'll have parking on the south side of the track. Is there any other ideas for trying to restore anything else on that site, like that switch track, where that would be something that you would cover, like how it used to be a covered area?
When you mentioned switch track, I think you're talking about the turntable.
Yeah, the turntable,
right.
Sorry.
All right, so about the turntable. That's under the control of Greenport Village, and there's been no talk about restoring the turntable. Although at one time, We did have an engineer look at the turntable very early when I had first joined the museum. That vision of running the train between Greenport and Riverhead was still very much on the front burner. So the Railroad Museum of Long Island actually purchased a turntable from the Arcade and Attica Railroad. And one of my first big projects after joining the museum was to transport this 60-ton iron bridge from south of Buffalo to Riverhead, with the idea that we would put that on our site at Riverhead so that we could turn the steam locomotive or any locomotive and run it back to Greenport. So part of that project and that vision was we would eventually ask the Long Island Railroad for permission to license the turntable here in Greenport. So toward that end, we had engineering survey of the turntable done, and we talked about what it was going to take to restore that to operation. Now, this would have been back in 2000. So
Okay.
this is 23 years ago. That turntable has sat outside and continued to have the elements work on it for another 23 years.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that at the time when we had it looked at, it meant taking the bridge, the physical turntable, the big black iron thing, up and out of the pit and setting it there in the parking lot and essentially disassembling, because all of the cross members that hold the two girders together show great wasting from being exposed to the elements over the many, many years that it's been there. And that turntable went back to the early 1900s. So, you're looking at something that's been sitting out there for over 100 years. And the salt water, hot, cold, there's a lot of erosion on it. So we were actually looking at more money to restore the Greenport turntable than it was to take the turntable from the Buffalo area and drop it into the ground at Riverhead. The pit wall needs attention. Masonry needs to be redone. Although at the time it was sturdy enough, it's just a matter of repointing it and covering it. The ties that the circular rail that the turntable rests and turns on, they all need to be replaced. It would not be inexpensive to restore that turntable. Could it be done? Absolutely, but at a great cost, and it would have to play into some operation. And we're not going to see the museums operating tourist train back and forth to use it. So that leaves it up to the railroad, really. And there have been conversations over the last 15 years where someday in the future, depending upon how the Long Island Railroad grows and how much demand there is for increased rail traffic out to the North Fork, that the railroad itself sees that turntable as an asset. Because from an operational standpoint, on every railroad, when you get to the end of the line, you want to have a way to turn your cars. You want to have a way to turn a locomotive so that you can move back and forth. Today, we do use push-pull service so that there's a cab on one end where the engineer sits and the locomotive's on the other end of the train, and it pushes it back to New York. The engineer sits up in the locomotive as it comes out to Greenport. So the need for turntables, or what we call a Y, a triangular piece of track where you can run up and back and move your engine or your cars around. The demand may not be as strong, but you still need it at your terminals. So I know from conversations, the Long Island Railroad still covets that turntable at Greenport as an asset. So, to cover it, to do anything to it would be very, very, very expensive. There has to be an end goal. Why would we do that? And it really is a functioning tool for a railroad to be able to take a piece of equipment and turn it around and send it back in the other direction. And I don't see that happening. As far as growth at Greenport, we're limited with all of the other activities that go on the property. Riverhead, again, we're limited there by the size of what we've got. Our footprint is what it is. And at Riverhead, they continue to move forward with a transportation hub area where people can live, walk to the train. So it's zoning, it's planning for a transportation area so people can get in and out of town and live in Riverhead. That's moving forward with a whole host of apartment buildings and other amenities that are being built around the museum there. So we're kind of limited in what we're going to be able to do at Riverhead too. So short of picking up the museums and moving them to an entirely new place on the railroads, I see our facilities staying the way they are, encouraging and growing people to come and learn about this railroad, and changing up the exhibits in our existing space.
And just one last question. It doesn't have exactly to do with the Railroad Museum, but just with the Long Island Railroad. Do you feel that there is a future? Because I think the South Fork has gotten more push with more frequency for the trains going back and forth. Do you see us getting more frequency? And is it possible, because I know they're still using diesel on the North Road, and it is really just the one track. I feel like if they added more frequency, they might have to add a track that they can pull over into to let other trains go by. And I know it's probably controversial for some people because some people don't want more frequency of the train.
Save what's already here. Don't. Going back to earlier in our podcast, talking about Paul Stoutenberg and my having an epiphany at 32 years old, it takes me back to a conversation I had with my dad. My dad, after being a carpenter for many years and constructing new houses here on the North Fork, sat for a county test and became a building inspector for the town of Southold, and eventually was chief building inspector for a few years before retiring. And I can remember as a young man, because there's always this yin and yang, this give and take, this tug of war about, close off the North Fork. We've got enough people. Keep it the way it is. Don't let more people come back out here, yada, yada, yada. I said, well, in my youthful stupidity, I said, well, why don't we just put up a gate, and say, close the gate, we're out here. And he was very thoughtful. My dad had a lot of patience. He said, son, we like living here. This was before I had this epiphany at 32, and I understand what he was saying now. We really enjoy living here. This is a beautiful place. It's a great place to live and to grow. It wouldn't be fair, first off, to stop people from coming here because they want to be here too. And This is America. This is, we don't cut people off from an area. He says, what's important to us here in Southold town is our process of planning and zoning. Now, again, this goes back to the 1960s. I'm having this conversation with him. So, we're 50 years ago. And as I look at where I live today, I think we've done a pretty good job with keeping open space, our transfer of development rights, the work that the Peconic Land Trust has done, being able to see the vineyards come and produce here and keep the value in agriculture. It keeps our spaces open. Planning of trying to center your populations around the hamlet centers. All of the things that we've been doing over the last 50 years. When my father said the key is zoning and the key is planning, has kept this place what it is today. And there are people that are going to say, oh my God, it's changed so much. Other than traffic, other than automobile traffic, I still see and appreciate the entire breadth of the North Fork, the open spaces that we have. And remember, the railroad coming here and its game changer in agriculture helped to show the value of this open space and helped to produce and create that economy. So now where does this come in play? Will we see more traffic out here from the railroad? I think it's possible. It's very, 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 very expensive. So that means there has to be a demand for it. Right now, the demand is growing very, very slowly. Now, post-COVID, we have many more people from the West End and from New York City who have moved here. They, as my wife and I have. We enjoy going into the city to go back and to do the things that entertain us, to learn, to go back and forth. We are still in a commuter mode or thought process of like, well, you get on the train in Greenport, you're going to go to New York City. I think as time goes on and our economy on the island continues to grow and change, if we see people wanting to get on the train in Greenport to go to work in Riverhead, because as I said, traffic is our number one change that I have seen in my lifetime. We've got so much more traffic. When we have a demand for people to go from Greenport to Riverhead, from Greenport to a new station and economic center in Yaphank, to go from here to Ronkonkoma and work in that transportation hub that they're building in Ronkonkoma, and then get back on the train and come back to Greenport, that is going to create the demand. That's when I think, my opinion, you're going to see a focus on getting more trains to the North Fork. As long as we continue to be a one-seat ride to New York City and back, I think that it's going to be a very slow growth that I may not see in my lifetime. The road is there. The railroad is there. It is an asset. It is an asset to the MTA, to the state, and to every one of us that live here. If we show a demand and we show a need, it will come. We saw that on the South Fork. We saw the people. You cannot move down Sunrise Highway in the morning and in the evening. This is one of the reasons we see so much traffic here with the trade parade going across Shelter Island, because people that are going to work Sag Harbor, East Southampton, Bridgehampton, and out into Amagansett and Montauk, by Jove, it may cost them more money to go over two ferries, but they can get there faster. They get an extra 15 minutes, half an hour of sleep in the morning like I did before I went to work at school. Well, they can do that now because they come down the North Fork. They go across Shelter Island, and now they can get into the northern part of the South Fork and out to the east. This is what drives the demand for increased train service and that little shuttle that runs back and forth from like Montauk to Spionk. They are a one-track railroad over there as well, as we are one track from Ronkonkoma to Greenport. Now, you mentioned places where a train could pull off. We have a siding, two sidings here at Greenport. We have a siding at Southold. We have a siding in Mattituck. Riverhead has a siding. Calverton has a siding, and so on up closer to Ronkonkoma. So there are places where your thought is very good. And when we've had maritime festivals, when we've had the tall ships here at Greenport, the railroad has responded to the demand of people coming out here by having a train run from Riverhead to Greenport on its own schedule in amongst the regular train from Ronkonkoma to Greenport. It can be done. It can be done. At what cost? Because ultimately, every time you get paid 2%, at least 2%, if not more today, of your salary, Chris, goes to the MTA. There is a tax. There's a tax on our salaries, which came about to help support transportation. So at what cost? How much more money is it going to cost, and what is the demand, and will people use it? It's like triage. The MTA, it's not an endless bucket of money. They have to put their finances and they have to put their focus on maintenance, repair, and expansion into the areas where the demand is. And of course, this 4 years of COVID, everything's going topsy-turvy. and there were really big projects that had been started before COVID came to fruition during COVID. The 3-track main line going through Hicksville and on into the reaches west. The Grand Central East Side Access.
Yes.
Getting that in. 2-track main from the Farmingdale area out to Ronkonkoma, where you don't have to worry about sidings. You got 2 tracks in that area. These were tremendously large projects that cost a great deal of money. And I believe that if COVID hadn't come along and upended everything in our society and our culture, those three huge projects alone would have seen so much more success and so much more positive discussion amongst us. But that's where the people are. That's where they're doing their transport back and forth, their commuting. So what's, looking into the crystal ball, I don't know what's going to happen here on the North Fork. I can tell you that turntable is still an asset. Just the fact that those words were uttered, there is a thought at the Long Island Railroad to growth on the North Fork. Some people have said to me, it's the only place that the railroad can grow because they're maxed out in so many other areas. I don't know that that's true. But certainly the space, time is here for growth, but we have to show a need, and because it's extremely expensive. To bring electricity out here, to run electric trains to Greenport, wow. We really need to get a lot of people moving from Greenport that want to go back and forth. So that's, there's my 2 cents for what it's worth.
No, I was just curious about that. But no, I want to thank you for your time and coming in today. And it was really interesting to hear you with growing up in Southold and all the things you've done for the North Fork, and also with the Railroad Museum of Long Island. And definitely go check out the museum. And it's usually in the spring.
The Greenport site opens Memorial Day weekend, and it's open through Columbus Day weekend. And then we have our open house, our holiday open house. Right now it's the second weekend in December at Greenport. Riverhead, we're open Saturdays only from the first Saturday in April through Memorial Day. And then we open Saturdays and Sundays along with Greenport through the summer. After Columbus Day, Riverhead drops back to 1 day a week until the end of the year. And right now this is precipitated on the fact that we're 100% volunteer, and almost most of our people have full-time jobs. And our business plan, we see keeping us 100% volunteer. There's no demand or necessary movement toward having executive directors and hiring docents and doing things. Right now, we have about 300 people every year as members. And I'm very pleased to say that our working volunteers from our membership run anywhere from 150 to 175 members.
Wow.
During the year. And that's very successful for us. So the fact that we do not have to depend on salaried people to operate the museum, and we do as well as we do, I see us continuing. But that also means that, we're basically a seasonal weekend attraction or operation. You can call. There are days at Riverhead, and there are ways to make an appointment to come in during the week at Greenport. We have quite a large library and archive. People will come to us on Tuesdays, and we will also reach out electronically to you if you are doing research for a paper in high school or college, a term paper. If you need to know something about the railroad, you can contact us through our website, rmli.org, and send us a request. We've got 7 or 8 guys that work in our library. We do a lot of research for folks, and right now we're not charging for it. So if you need information for a book you're writing, recently we've been talking with feature article writers for the newspapers. We have photographs. We are a great resource as well as being a historic and an entertainment site. We're a resource for scholars. So that's all going on, all 100% volunteer. So reach out to us. We'll help you with that. And basically seasonal during the summer on the weekends. Come and visit.
Wonderful. Thank you again for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you all enjoyed episode 7 with Don Fisher. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next week.